Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel and like videos about making guitars, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. So what I'm going to be talking about in today's video is part 13 of my electric violin build. And what I plan to do is make and install the humbucker pickup that I have designed for use on this violin. And then once that's done, I'm going to test play the violin. Now, when I say play, I use that term very loosely. I don't know how to play a violin, so I'm basically just gonna run the bow over the strings, and we'll see how it sounds with this pickup. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to remove the humbucker pickup, and I'm going to replace it with piezo pickups. There's 3 of them here. I'll put 2 of them on the body and 1 of them on the back of the bridge. And then I'm going to test play that one. And what I'll do through the miracle of film editing is I will put the 2 demos back to back so that you compare how the violin sounds with the humbucker pickup as well as with the piezos. Now, as you can see, I've already made and installed the humbucker pickup. So through the miracle of time travel, let's go back and I'll show you how I made and install this, and we'll go forward from there. Since I'm going to fabricate a pickup, that means I'm going to have to make the base plate, the bobbins, and the cover. So I decided to use my resin 3D printer to fabricate those parts. In truth, it took multiple prototypes before I came up with components that I felt were really going to work. With resin 3D printing, you don't have the option of colors. It's really either white, gray, or black, and all I had was gray resin. So I wanted these pickups to, or at least the cover, to be black, and that meant I was going to have to do a little bit of prep sanding before I could paint them. Of course, I could have splurged and bought some black resin, but I've found that the black resin has a tendency to cure in a kind of rubbery way. So I just opted to grab my airbrush and some Createx flat black paint and spray the covers to get them that nice flat black color. When I designed this pickup, I had a challenge that I needed to deal with, and that is the fact that the adjustable pull screws were going to have to be at different heights in order to match the radius of the fingerboard and the strings, because the radius is pretty tight. It's like 42 millimeters. And that means those screws on the ends are going to have to be much lower than the screws at the center of each bobbin. And since the bottom of the screws are flush with the bottom of the bobbin, I don't have any room to lower those screws without them ramming into the base plate. So what I was going to have to do was cut each screw to its own custom length. So I measured that out, and then I took my Dremel with a cutting disc and I just cut off the right amount from the tip of each screw. And of course, I have to keep the screws organized, otherwise I'll be putting the wrong length screw into the wrong hole in the bobbin. And once I had all the screws cut to their appropriate lengths, I decided to dummy together the pickup just to make sure that I was reasonably close to having each screw the correct length before I continued on with making the pickup. So I installed the screws and then dummied together the bobbins and the cover to see how the radius of the top of the screws would follow the radius of the fingerboard and the strings. And right off the bat, it wasn't exactly perfect, but it was close enough that I knew I could go back later on and tweak the length of some of those screws just to get them exactly the right length. The next step was to wind the coils, and I didn't really have a plan of attack here. I didn't know how many turns to put on each bobbin. I just simply pulled a number out of the air and decided I'd go with that, and we'll just see what happens. So I'm using my CNC winder here to wind both coils, and that way I can be assured that the 2 coils will be exactly the same, which means a better chance of the highest possible quality in a humbucking signal. The bobbins in this pickup are quite a bit shorter than the traditional bobbin that you would find in a guitar humbucker. So it would make sense to put more turns of coil in order to make the signal stronger. But again, this is new territory. I've never been in this realm before, and I don't know anybody else who has either. So I'm just sort of taking shots at the dark to see what's going to happen. In the end, I decided to shut the winder off at 4,500 turns. That seems like a good number. And we'll see what that measures out to in terms of DC resistance once I get the start and finish leads soldered on to the ends of the coil wire. For the lead wires, I typically will use 22 gauge wire for the start and finish wires, and I'll color code them. I like to use black for the start and then red for the finish. That way I can keep track of the start and finish so that I can wire the two coils together in series and thereby making them a hum canceling pickup. The way I like to solder my leads is first I'll tin each end of that short length of lead wire. And then I'll take the start or the finish end of the coil and wrap it around one end of that lead. Get a nice amount of coil wire wrapped around that exposed tinned end of the lead. And then I'll touch it with my soldering iron to melt the solder, which in turn will encase that coil wire that's wrapped around the lead in the solder so that it's firmly bonded to the lead wire itself. And then once I have both lead wires soldered onto the start and finish of the bobbin, I like to cover the solder joints with a short length of heat shrink tubing. That way that solder joint isn't going to short out against the coil wire. Then I'll wrap the lead wires around the bobbin just to get everything kind of nice and cleaned up. And to cover up and protect the coil, I'll wrap it all in some coil tape. Now it was time to install the screws, and of course I had to really be careful here that I was installing the right length screw into the right hole. The screws that are on the outer parts of the bobbin, the outer two holes, those are the shortest screws. And of course the bobbin that is in the front of the pickup towards the fingerboard, all those screws are shorter in length, but again with those outer screws being the shortest. That way I get that correct radius as well as how the strings descend from the bridge toward the nut. Of course, these screws have not been magnetized, and even if I try to magnetize them, they wouldn't hold a charge. Instead, just like with a traditional humbucker, you have to install a magnet that is in contact with the screws in order for them to be magnetized and to remain magnetized. And to do that, I decided I would use an Alnico 5 pickup magnet. Now, of course, the pickup magnet is much longer. And what that meant I had to do was grab a hacksaw and cut off a portion of that magnet in order to shorten it to the length that I needed. And then just for grins, I grabbed my Gauss meter to see what the strength of the magnet was, and it looks like it's pretty fully charged. Now the next thing I had to do before I could continue assembling the pickup is I decided I'm going to ground the base plate. Well, the base plate is plastic since it was printed on a resin printer. So what I did was I coated the inside of it with a piece of copper foil. And the plan is to solder the ground of my 4-conductor lead to that copper so that the entire surface that the bobbins are mounted to has been grounded and therefore shielded. Now, as you can see here, the magnet is placed on top of the bobbins. Now, I don't really know for sure why I did it that way. I think it was to keep everything sort of compact, but it also meant that I couldn't lower those adjustment screws further into the bobbins. But, you know, that's just how it kind of turned out. I think if I had to do it all over again, I would probably make this pickup to be more like a traditional humbucker pickup with the magnet underneath the bobbins. But it didn't happen that way, so we'll see what happens. Hooking up the 4-conductor lead wire was done pretty much following the Seymour Duncan color code, which is what I've always done on all my pickups. And it just works for me, and I can keep it straight, and I never have to think about it. So the two bobbins are actually wired together in series. And then I have a hot wire, which in this case is going to be green, and then the black, which will be ground. And it's also soldered together with the bare shielding wire that's soldered to the copper foil that's on the bottom of the base plate. So everything fits together and functions pretty much like your typical humbucker pickup. With the assembly complete, I wanted to check both the DC resistance as well as inductance. And I checked DC resistance just to make sure that the coils are working and that there aren't any shorts anywhere in the wiring. And here it shows that it's testing out at about 6,500 DC resistance. Then I switched it over to measure the henries to see what the inductance would be, which was 1.77. As I was setting up the pickup in position on the violin, I discovered I was going to need to drill a hole in the bridge in order to route the wiring out the back. Of course, I couldn't just do a YouTube search for how to drill a hole into a violin bridge, so I had to wing it. Obviously, before I can plug the violin into my amplifier, I need to have a jack. And even though I could just simply solder an output jack directly to the pickup, that would be kind of cheesy, so I decided to go ahead and fabricate a mount that is similar to other violin jacks that I've seen out there on the market. So I just grabbed a piece of scrap rosewood and cut out the shape that I needed and drilled the holes to accept a mount as well as the jack itself. With the shape and the position of the holes marked on the piece of rosewood, I took it over to my drill press and drilled holes for the jack itself, which is going to be one of those panel jacks, or a barrel jack as some people like to call them. And then there's 2 holes to accept what will be used to clamp the jack mount to the violin itself, which is just a typical pair of violin clamps. They're screw clamps, and they're usually used for clamping chin rests to a violin. And since this mount is going to be installed on the top of the violin and is therefore going to be visible, I wanted it to look nice. So I sanded it and then applied some polymerized tung oil. Then once that oil had dried overnight, I installed the jack into the mount itself. And this is how the jack mounts onto the body. And it's the same approach as the chin rest that you see up there at the top of the picture. However, I kind of think that this may not be the most reliable way to install the jack because you really have to clamp it down hard. And the act of especially unplugging the cord or the cable to the amplifier could pull the jack right off the violin. So I may think of something else for a future build down the road. Then it was time to install the pickups. And that was pretty much a straightforward approach of positioning the pickup, routing the wire, and then soldering the hot lead and the ground lead to the appropriate lugs on the jack. Now this is all kind of temporary because I'm not sure if I'm going to stick with this solution. So I soldered everything into position just to make sure it would hold up well. And then the pickup itself, I decided I would temporarily install using just some simple double-sided sticky tape on the back just to hold it into position. Later on, if I decided this is the route that I'm going to stick with, I could replace that double-sided sticky tape with a more industrial strength double-sided sticky tape. But this stuff is easy to remove, so I can pull the pickup out without damaging the wood. Okay, so the way that I'm going to record the violin is I'm going to clip my lavalier mic to the front of my work stand here, and that is about 6 feet away from my Crate Palomino V16 tube amplifier that I have the violin plugged into. So I'll play it with the humbucker, then I'm going to swap out the humbucker for the piezos, and then I'll record that as well using the same approach. That way we get the same kind of ambient room sound of the violin played electrically. So that way I think you get a more even, consistent comparison between the two sounds. Okay guys, which scenario did you like the best? The humbucker, the piezos on the front, or the piezos on the back? I know which one I like the best. I'm going to favor the humbucker simply because I felt the tone was more balanced. And this is something you may not be able to tell in the video, because once this video is compressed and uploaded to YouTube, the audio, I can't vouch for the audio, but playing this violin here in person in this room with my ears detecting what it sounds like, I felt that the humbucker had a more balanced tone, balanced in terms of treble, mid-range, and bass. It was, however, much weaker, and that's to be expected because a humbucker is designed to detect strings that are vibrating mostly side to side. That's what makes the humbucker work. In the case of a violin, there's subtle vibrations, but they tend to work with the wood itself to produce the sound. And a humbucker just doesn't do as efficient a job of detecting that type of string movement and wood movement. So it's going to produce a much weaker signal. I think in order for the humbucker to actually work in a violin, the bobbins would have to be much longer or much larger and wound with much more wire to generate a higher output signal. That's something I might explore in the future, who knows. But as it stands right now, in terms of signal strength and volume, I definitely think the piezos work the best. However, in my opinion, they are almost painfully too bright. Now, granted, I'm using 3 piezos on this setup, and that may be a bit overkill. However, just so you know, I did experiment with 1 and 2 piezos to see if there was much of a difference, and there just really wasn't. It still produces a loud and painfully bright sound. So I felt that by moving the piezos to the back of the violin tamed it down somewhat, and it makes it a little bit more useful. I think that to make that scenario work on a regular basis, I would need to have a good EQ section on my amplifier, or at least a good EQ pedal or processor between the violin and the amplifier so that I could get everything dialed in, especially in different environments, to get the sound exactly the way I want it. So I think for the time being, I'm just going to stick with the piezos, because there are some other issues with the humbuckers. And that really brings me to what I plan to talk about in the next episode, which will be the last episode in this build. And what I want to do is talk about everything that I learned while building this violin project. Because as I had hoped, I learned quite a bit building this violin that I can apply to building my electric guitars. And that's one of the reasons why I'll step away from electric guitars and work on other types of instruments, because you can learn things and develop skills that you can carry over to building electric guitars. Skills and ideas that you would have never encountered if you just built electric guitars. So we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If so, give it a thumbs up and do all that good stuff. Subscribe to the channel. Shop the eGuitar Plans web store or my Highline Guitars merch store and all that good stuff. And click the thanks button, leave a tip. At any rate, until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for future guitar building episodes.